The smoke was visible from the Turner property on a clear morning, which was most mornings in that valley in February. Elias Turner noticed it, the way he noticed most things on his neighbor's land, with the background attention of a man who had been looking at the same valley from the same window every morning for 11 years. The specific attention that proximity and familiarity produced, the kind of noticing that was less an act of observation than a confirmation of what was already expected to be there. Hensley's chimney smoked in the mornings. It had smoked every morning since Hensley built the cabin in the spring of 1874, and before that, the previous occupant's chimney had smoked in the mornings, going back to whenever the first family had come into this particular narrow valley and decided to stay. The chimney was as much a feature of Turner's morning view as the ridge behind it. He had been watching it for 8 years. He knew its smoke the way you knew any repeated sight, not the specific quality of each morning's smoke, but the general reliability of it, the confirmation that the farm was there and operating, and that Hensley was in it, doing what Hensley did in the mornings. What was not expected was that Hensley had left for the trading post 4 days ago. Turner set his coffee cup down and looked at the smoke rising from the chimney of the empty farm. He thought, Hensley came back in the night. He thought, the trip to Garvey's post and back was 2 days in ordinary conditions, and the conditions of this February had been ordinary. Cold but passable, the valley road rutted but not snowbound. Hensley should have been back 2 days ago, and the most natural explanation for a chimney smoking on a farm whose owner had been expected back 2 days ago was that the owner had come back, possibly in the dark, possibly tired from the road, possibly not inclined to announce his return to the valley. Turner accepted this and went about his morning. He noticed the smoke again in the afternoon, which was less automatic. You did not notice a chimney in the afternoon the way you noticed it in the morning. The light was wrong, and the angle was different, and the afternoon had its own business to occupy you. He noticed it because he was looking at the ridge, and the ridge was behind Hensley's farm, and the smoke was in his line of sight. Still rising, steady, the specific quality of smoke from a stove that was being maintained, not the thin, dying thread of a fire burning itself out. He thought, Hensley is home and keeping a fire, the way a man kept a fire in February. He thought nothing further about it that day. Caleb Hensley had farmed the valley since 1874, 8 years, long enough to be a known quantity in the settlement's accounting of itself. He was 63 years old, a widower of 6 years. His wife Ruth had died in the spring of 1876 from a fever that the settlement could not manage with what it had, and he had been farming alone since his daughter Clara had married a man from the South Valley and moved with him to his people's land near the river. That had been in 1879. Since then, Hensley had been the specific kind of alone that came from a farm built for more people than were left on it. The rooms that had been family rooms now, single-occupant rooms. The table set for one, the rhythms of the farm organized around one man's capacity and schedule. He was not a difficult man or an unhappy one, as far as the valley could tell. He farmed well, and he maintained his property well, and he was present at the settlement's collective occasions in the specific way of a man who was not seeking community, but who recognized its value and participated in it as part of the ordinary obligation of living among people. He had friends in the valley. Turner was one of them, and the Gear family at the south end, and old Pratt, who had known him from before the valley. He was the kind of man who was missed when he was absent, and who made the absence comfortable for others by the reliability of his return. Turner had been in his kitchen twice in the fall, and what he had noticed both times was the quality of the place. the specific arrangement of a man who had been alone in a space long enough that the space had organized itself around him. Not untidy, not neglected, the opposite. The boots placed in the same spot by the door each time, the table with its single chair turned at the same angle, the woodpile stacked with the specific care of a man for whom the woodpile was not just a resource, but a measure. The kettle in the same position on the stove. A farm that had been shaped by one man's habits over years until the habits and the farm were a single thing, the shape of a life pressed into the shape of a place. He had thought, both times, that it was the farm of a man who lived there completely. Not a man passing through. Not a man with somewhere else on his mind. A man who was, in the specific full sense, home. He had left for Garvey's trading post on the morning of February 7th, 1882, with a full wagon load of grain, the season's remainder, the portion that exceeded what he would need through spring planting. The trip to Garvey's post was 12 miles south along the Valley Road and 12 miles back, a journey that took most of one day going and most of one day returning, and that required one night on the road or at the post, depending on how the trading went and how late the day was when business concluded. He had made the trip before. He expected to be back on the evening of the 8th or the morning of the 9th. Turner had waved him off from the road on the morning of the 7th and had thought nothing more about it. On the morning of the 10th, he was looking at the smoke. The smoke continued on the 11th. By the second day, the valley's attention had begun, in the quiet way that a small community's attention began when something slightly out of the ordinary persisted past the point where ordinary explanations ran out. Not alarm, the valley was not alarmed, but a low-level awareness, the kind that moved through small communities in the form of brief mentions when people happened to cross paths, the kind that accumulated without anyone deciding to accumulate it. The valley had its unspoken rules about this kind of accumulation, and one of them was that you did not go to a neighbor's door uninvited. Not in the specific way that meant rudeness. People in the valley went to each other's doors, and no one thought worse of anyone for it. But there was a distinction between going to a neighbor's door because you had a reason, and going because you were curious, and curiosity was not, in the valley's understanding of itself, a sufficient reason. Hensley had presumably come back. Hensley was a private man. Hensley had not invited anyone over. The smoke was not by itself an emergency, so the valley watched and noted and did not act, which was the correct behavior and which produced the specific quality of those 2 days, the awareness growing and the awareness not being acted on, and the tension between those two things building in the particular way it built in communities that were both attentive and restrained. Anna Gear, whose family farmed the south end of the valley, and whose morning walk to the creek sometimes passed within sight of the Hensley farm, mentioned it to her husband at the noon meal on the 11th. She said, "Hensley's fire is still going." She said, "I thought he was due back day before yesterday." Her husband said, "Probably came back late." He said, "Probably road trouble." Anna said, "Probably." She said nothing further. She had the quality of a woman who said what she had to say, and then filed the rest. And what she filed was the specific quality of the smoke she had seen. Not the thin smoke of a fire that had been lit that morning and was building, and not the thick smoke of a fire that was being pushed for heat in a cold house. The in-between smoke of a fire that had been going for some time and was being maintained at a steady temperature. The smoke of a fire that someone was tending, the same quality every morning. She had walked past the farm on the 10th and again on the 11th, and both mornings the smoke had been identical. Same temperature, same consistency, same steady rise into the cold February air. She had thought, the mark of a man who keeps his fire carefully. She had also thought, the mark of a fire that is being kept, rather than merely going. The distinction was subtle, and she was not certain she could explain it to her husband, and so she did not try. Turner's wife Margaret noticed it on the afternoon of the 11th from the yard, where she was bringing in wood. She looked at the smoke for a long moment, not the passing glance of a woman occupied with other things, but the sustained attention of a woman who had been aware of the smoke for 2 days and was now deciding what she thought about it. She went inside and said to Turner, "Is Hensley back?" Turner said, "He should be." She said, "His fire has been going since yesterday morning." She said, "I've been watching it. Every time I'm outside, the same smoke, the same quality of it." Turner said, "So he's back," she said. "Have you seen him?" Turner thought about it and said, "No," he said, "but I haven't been over." Margaret said, "His horse isn't in the pasture." Turner went to the window and looked at the Hensley pasture, which was visible from their property across the lower field. The pasture was empty. Hensley's horse, a gray mare named Dolly, that he used for the wagon and for the occasional riding trip, was not in the pasture. Hensley took Dolly to Garvey's post when he went with the wagon, and if Dolly was not in the pasture, Hensley had not returned with the wagon. Turner said, "Could have put her in the barn," Margaret said. "In February? He never keeps her in the barn except in bad weather." She said, "I know his habits." He said it, and I believe it. She said, "Something is not right over there." Turner said, "I'll go over in the morning if the smoke is still up." Margaret said, "The smoke will be up." She said it without drama, as a statement of what she expected. And she was right. The smoke was still up on the morning of the 12th. Turner went to the Gear farm first and found Jacob Gear at the woodpile and said, "I'm going to check on Hensley." Jacob put down his axe and said, "I'll come." They rode over together on the 12th, a cold, clear February morning, the ground frozen and the valley silent in the specific silence of a windless winter day. The Hensley farm was a quarter-mile from the Turner property along the valley road, close enough to be seen from Turner's window, and far enough to be a destination rather than a neighborly call, the distance that in a small valley required a decision to cross. They came down the road toward the farm, and Turner watched the chimney as they approached. The smoke was steady and pale, the pale gray of a hardwood fire at good temperature, not the white of a greenwood fire, and not the dark of a fire that was struggling. The smoke of a fire that was being managed. He had seen thousands of chimneys in his life, and this one looked like every other chimney except for the fact that no one was inside. He had the specific feeling, coming into the yard, of a place that was occupied. Not a feeling he examined or trusted, but one he noted. The farm had the quality of a working farm in the morning, the specific quality of warmth in the air that a heated house produced on a cold day, the faint smell of wood smoke, the stillness of a property that was at rest between tasks, rather than the stillness of a property that was empty. He had been on empty farms before, and he knew what they felt like, and this did not feel like that. He said nothing of this to Jacob. They came into the Hensley yard, and the Turner noticed the barn doors first. Shut, both of them, the way they were shut when the barn was empty, not the particular alignment of doors that were shut with an animal inside, the slight variation in the latch that Hensley always left when Dolly was in the barn, so the mare could work the latch from inside if she needed to. The doors were shut the way empty barn doors were shut, which meant Dolly was not in the barn. Turner got down from his horse and looked at the yard. The ground was frozen hard, which meant the yard showed the tracks that had been pressed into it before the last hard freeze. Hensley's boot prints going to the barn and back, the wagon ruts from the departure on the 7th, the ordinary evidence of a working farm's yard in the days before the freeze. No new tracks. Nothing pressed into the frozen ground after the freeze had set, which Turner estimated at the night of the 9th. Hensley had not come back into this yard after the night of the 9th. The chimney was smoking. Jacob Gear had dismounted and was standing beside Turner, looking at the same things Turner was looking at, doing the same accounting. He said, "Wagon ruts going out." He said, "No ruts coming back." Turner said, "The ground froze." On the 9th, Jacob said, "So if he came back before the freeze?" Turner said, "Then there should be ruts coming back alongside the ruts going out. There aren't." Jacob said, "So he hasn't come back." They both looked at the chimney. Turner said, "But the fire is going." Jacob said, "Yes." They looked at each other briefly, in the way that two men looked at each other when they had arrived at an account that didn't hold and needed to decide what to do next. Then Turner went to the door and knocked. Waited. Knocked again. No answer from inside. No sound from inside. He put his hand on the door latch and looked at Jacob, and Jacob nodded, and Turner opened the door. The stove was burning. Not recently lit, not building to temperature, burning at full heat, the specific red-orange glow at the firebox seams that a stove produced when it had been at temperature for some time and was being fed steadily. Turner could feel the heat from the doorway. The single room of the cabin was warm in a way that required sustained fire, not the quick warmth of a just-stoked fire, but the deep warmth of a space that had been heated continuously, the warmth that saturated the walls and the furniture and the air, the warmth of a room that someone had been keeping. The kettle was on, not just on the stove, boiling. The specific sound of a kettle that had been on long enough to reach a full rolling boil, steam at the spout, the water level lower than it would have been when it was set. Someone had filled the kettle and set it to boil sometime in the last hour. Turner and Jacob stood in the doorway and looked at the burning stove and the boiling kettle and the warm room. No one was in it. Turner stepped inside and looked at the door area first, the corner where Hensley kept his boots when he was in the house, the peg where his winter coat hung. No boots, no coat. He looked at the table, clean, set with nothing, no cup or plate or evidence of a meal. He looked at the sleeping area, partitioned by a hanging blanket. He went and pulled the blanket aside. The bed was made, the way Hensley made his bed in the morning, with the specific tight-tucked character of a man who had learned to make a bed in the military and who had never stopped. Made and empty. Jacob had gone to the stove and opened the firebox and was looking at what was inside. He said, "It's got wood in it." Turner said, "Of course it does." Jacob said, "Fresh wood." He said, "Look." Turner went and looked. The wood in the firebox was burning, but the pieces that were not yet fully caught, the pieces that had been added most recently, showed the specific pale color of fresh-cut timber rather than the seasoned gray of wood that had been split and stacked for a season. Pale wood with a slight green cast, the moisture still in it. The kind of wood that produced more smoke and less heat than seasoned wood, and that a man who knew fire management did not use if he had a choice. Turner said, "That's green wood." Jacob said, "Cut recently." He said, "Green wood doesn't season in a woodpile. That came off a living tree." Turner said, "When?" Jacob said, "Recently?" He said, "Green wood that fresh has been cut in the last day or two at the most." He said, "Maybe this morning." They stood at the open firebox and looked at the green wood burning alongside the older seasoned pieces and thought about what they were looking at. Turner said, "Where's the woodpile?" They went outside to the woodpile at the cabin's east wall. Hensley kept a good woodpile, split and stacked and covered, the specific organized woodpile of a man who took his winter preparations seriously. Turner and Jacob looked at the pile, and then they looked at the ground around it. No fresh-cut chips. No axe marks on the stump that Hensley used for splitting. The axe itself was in its place, leaning against the cabin wall where it always leaned, undisturbed. The woodpile was the woodpile, exactly as it had been, exactly as Turner had seen it when he had been at the Hensley farm 2 weeks prior for a different errand. The green wood in the stove had not come from this woodpile. It had not been cut in this yard. Turner said, "Where?" Jacob said nothing. Turner said, "The wood in the stove was not cut here, and it was not from the pile." He said, "It came from somewhere else." Jacob said, "It came from somewhere, yes." Turner said, "And it was brought in and loaded into the stove in the last day or two." He said, "By someone who wasn't here, because no one has been here." He said, "The ground is frozen, and the yard shows nothing, and the barn is empty, and the boots are not by the door." He said, "The fire is going, and I cannot account for the fire." Jacob Gear was not a man who was easily unsettled. He was 44 years old, and he had farmed this valley for 15 years, and he had the specific quality of a man who had dealt with enough genuine difficulty to have calibrated his responses to the actual severity of situations rather than their apparent severity. He stood in the Hensley yard in the February cold and looked at the chimney smoking and the undisturbed woodpile and the frozen ground that showed nothing new. And he was quiet for a while. He said, "Let's see if anyone else has been here." They walked the perimeter of the farm, the barn, the garden plot, the fence lines, the creek bank at the property's eastern edge. They were looking for tracks, for any evidence of approach or presence, for the physical record that the ground kept of what had been on it. The frozen ground gave them the tracks of the days before the freeze, Hensley's ordinary movements around his property in the days leading up to his departure. Nothing after the freeze. The perimeter was clean. At the barn they found the latch undisturbed, a thin skin of ice along the door's lower edge unbroken, the kind of ice that formed in the gap between door and frame when the door had not been opened in cold weather. The barn had not been opened since before the freeze. Turner looked at the ice for a moment, and then they moved on. At the garden plot the snow was undisturbed, a light dusting over the frozen beds, unmarked in every direction. At the fence lines, the same. The frost-covered rails showed nothing pressed against them, no climbing mark, no disturbance. The creek bank was last, and the creek bank gave them the most thorough record, because the soil near the water had not frozen as solidly as the yard and retained a capacity to take an impression that the harder ground had lost. They walked the bank in both directions for 50 yards and found nothing. Hensley's old boot prints from before the departure, the narrow deer tracks from 2 or 3 days prior, and nothing else. No approach from the creek, no approach from the timber, no approach from the road beyond what the frozen yard already showed. Jacob said, standing on the creek bank, "There are 2 things a person could say about this." Turner said, "What are they?" Jacob said, "The first is that whoever came here came before the freeze, when the ground was soft enough to hide it under what's already there." He said, "There are old tracks in the yard. A man who knew the farm could have moved through the old tracks without leaving new ones." He paused. "That's possible," Turner said, "and the second?" Jacob said, "The second is that no one came here." He said, "That the evidence is complete and honest, and what it shows is that no one has been on this property since before the freeze." He said, Those two things lead to different places. Turner said, "What does the second one lead to?" Jacob looked at the farm from the creek bank, the chimney still smoking, the woodpile undisturbed, the frozen yard unmarked. He said, "I don't know," he said, "somewhere I don't have a map for." They stood at the creek bank and looked at the farm. Turner said, "A fire doesn't start itself." Jacob said, "No." Turner said, "Someone built that fire. Someone cut that wood. Someone put the kettle on." He said, "The evidence says no one has been here." Jacob said, "The evidence says no one came from the road or the yard in a way that the frozen ground recorded." He said, "That's not nothing, but it's not the same as no one has been here." Turner looked at him. Jacob said, "I'm not saying what I think." He said, "I'm saying what the evidence says and what it doesn't say." He said, "Those are different things." Turner said, "Yes," he said, "they are." The valley came to know about the fire by the end of the 12th, the way the valley came to know things, not announced, not gathered around, but moved from person to person in the course of the ordinary transactions of a small farming community, the information finding its way to everyone who needed to know it by the end of the day. Anna Gear knew it because Jacob told her. Margaret Turner knew it because Turner told her. The Pratt family knew it because Pratt was at the Turner farm when Turner returned from the Hensley place, and Turner told him what they had found. Old Pratt, whose full name was Henry Pratt, and who had been in the valley since before most of the current families, who had known Hensley from another valley before either of them came here, sat in Turner's kitchen and heard the account and was quiet for a while. He was 70, and he had the specific quality of age that was not wisdom exactly, but was something adjacent to it, the quality of a man who had seen enough that the unexpected had lost its power to close off his thinking. He held things more comfortably than younger men. He held the fire in the empty farm and turned it over and did not try to put it down quickly. He said, "Hensley has been in this valley 8 years. Turner said, "Yes." Pratt said, "Before that, he was in the South Valley. Before that, he was in Tennessee." He said, "I knew him in Tennessee before he came west." He said, "Ruth was alive then, and Clara was young, and it was a different life." He said, "I will tell you something about Hensley." He said it in the way of a man who had decided to say something he had been carrying for a while, not because the moment demanded it, but because the moment permitted it. He said, "Hensley has a quality I've seen in a few men." He paused. "The farm knows him." He said, "I don't mean that the farm responds to him the way a trained animal responds to its owner." He said, "I mean the farm has been shaped by his attention across 8 years in a way that goes past the physical, the arrangements of it, the way it holds a particular order." He said, "I've been on farms where the farmer was present, and on farms where the farmer was absent, and there is a quality of the absent ones that is hard to describe, and that this farm has never had." He said, "I've been to Hensley's farm when Hensley wasn't there, and it has always felt occupied." Turner said, "That's a feeling." Pratt said, "Yes," he said, "I'm saying the feeling has a history, and the history goes back before this week." He said, "I don't think the farm needing a fire is something that started 3 days ago." Margaret Turner, who had been at the table listening, said, "Are you saying the farm kept its own fire?" Pratt said, "I'm saying I don't think those two things are as separate as they sound." He said, "Hensley will be back tomorrow or the next day." He said, "Ask him what he remembers of the last 3 nights." He said, "Ask him specifically about the fire." Hensley returned on the afternoon of the 13th. Turner saw the wagon coming up the valley road from the south and went to meet it at the Hensley gate, and Hensley pulled up and looked at him with the expression of a man who had been met at his own gate by a neighbor, and who understood, from the expression on the neighbor's face, that something had happened. He said, "What is it?" Turner said, "Come look at your farm." They went in together, and Turner showed him the stove. No longer boiling now, the fire having dropped over the course of the day since Turner and Jacob's visit. The wood burned down to coals, and the woodpile undisturbed, and the ground around it unchanged. He showed him the green wood ash in the firebox, the remnants of what had been burning the previous morning. He told him, "The fire was going when we came in yesterday." He said, 3 days from what we could see. He said, "The chimney was visible from my property." Hensley listened to all of this without speaking. He stood in his own kitchen and looked at his own stove and listened to Turner tell him that his farm had been maintaining its fire for 3 days while he was gone, and his face had the quality of a face receiving information that was new in its specifics and not entirely new in its general nature. Turner said, "You knew something about this." Hensley said, "Not this." He said, "Not," he gestured at the stove, "not this specifically." He said, "But not nothing." He said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as what it is, which is what I experienced, and not as the kind of thing that gets passed around." Turner said, "All right." Hensley sat down at the table. He sat with the deliberateness of a man who had been carrying something for 3 days and who was setting it down carefully. He said, 3 nights, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th. He said, "I was at Garvey's Post the first night, and on the road the 2nd, and at Alderman's Way House the 3rd. He said, "I dreamed all 3 nights. The same dream, or very close to it." He said, "I was here, in this room." He said, "I was standing at the stove, and I was feeding the fire." He said, "Not a short dream, not a dream you have in the turning of sleep. A long dream, the kind you can remember in the morning with the specific clarity of memory, rather than the fading quality of most dreams." He said, "I could feel the heat of the stove, and I could feel the weight of the wood, and I could smell the smoke and the cold air coming under the door." He said, "It was February in the dream. This February, the cold that has been on the valley this week, and the house needed to be kept, and I was keeping it." He said, "What I did in the dream was the same thing I always did on winter nights when I couldn't sleep." He said, "I got up and I fed the stove, and I sat in the chair by the window and I watched the valley." He paused. "It was dark in the dream, the same dark it is here in the middle of the night, and I could see the snow on the ridge, and the timber below it, and the road coming up from the south." He said, "I was watching the road." Turner said, "Watching for what?" Hensley said, "Watching for myself." He said it simply, without drama, as a statement of what the dream had contained. He said, "In the dream I was here, and I was also coming up the road. I could see myself coming. I knew it was me, because I knew the wagon, and I knew Dolly's way of moving, and I knew the shape of a man on a cold road after a long trip." He said, "In the dream I kept the fire for the man coming up the road, which was me." He said, "Each morning I woke up at Garvey's or on the road or at Alderman's, and each morning the dream was clear. And each morning I had the feeling of a man who has just stepped away from something rather than woken from it." He said, "The feeling of having left a place, not the feeling of having dreamed about one." He paused. He said, "I know what that sounds like." Turner said, "It sounds like what it sounds like." He said, "The fire was going." Hensley said, "Yes." Turner said, "For 3 days." Hensley said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. He looked at his stove and at the room around him, the table where he ate, the chair by the window where he sat, the particular arrangements of a life lived alone in a specific place for 8 years. He said, "Ruth died in this room." He said, "Clara learned to walk in this room." He said, "I have been alone here for 3 years, and some nights it is simply a room, and some nights it is everything that has happened in it, and I live in both at the same time." He said, "I have farmed this land for 8 years. The farm knows me." He said it in the matter-of-fact way of a man stating a thing he had known for a long time and had not felt the need to state before. He said, "I have not always been certain what that meant." He said, "I am more certain now." He said, "I can't tell you what kept the fire." He said, "I can tell you what I remember of those 3 nights, which is that I was here, in this room, keeping the fire the way you kept a fire when the night was cold and the house needed it and someone was coming home." He said, "I don't think those are separate things." Turner looked at him. He thought about what Pratt had said, about the farm knowing Hensley, about a quality of occupation that had been present in the farm since long before this week. He thought about the green wood in the firebox, the wood that could not have come from the woodpile or from the yard, the wood that had been in the stove burning that morning. He thought something fed that fire. He thought Hensley was on the road and Hensley was also here. He thought, those 2 things are not supposed to be possible simultaneously. He thought, the stove was hot, the kettle was boiling, the green wood was burning, the barn latch iced over and unbroken, the woodpile undisturbed, the frozen ground showing nothing after the freeze. These were not feelings or impressions. These were physical facts, the kind of facts that a man could stand beside and point at, the kind that did not change in the retelling. He thought, the only account that holds all of these facts simultaneously is Hensley's account. The dream that was not a dream, the man on the road who was also here, watching for himself coming up the valley road, keeping the fire for the man who was coming home. He sat with this and turned it the way he turned difficult problems, from every angle, looking for the place where it broke, the place where it required something he could not accept. He looked for that place, and he found that it was not in the facts. The facts accommodated Hensley's account. The only thing the account required him to accept was that a man could be in 2 places at once, and he could not accept that, and yet the facts did not care what he could accept. He sat with the account and could not close it and stopped trying to close it. He said after a while, "The smoke stopped this morning." Hensley said, "Yes," he said, "the morning I came home." He looked at his stove, the coals dying now, the heat fading from the room in the way heat faded when a fire was no longer being tended. He looked at it, the way a man looked at something that was both ordinary and not ordinary, both his and something more than his. He said, "I'll build it back up." He got the wood from the pile, and he fed the stove, and the fire came back up, and the room began to warm again, the ordinary warmth of a man back in his own house on a February afternoon. Turner sat at the table and watched him do it and said nothing. The settlement talked about the 3 days of smoke for the rest of that winter, and the talking had the specific quality of accounts that circulate in small communities when the account is true and also inexplicable. Careful, specific, without embellishment, the repetition of the evidence rather than the construction of a theory. Turner told it as he had found it. The stove burning, the kettle boiling, the green wood in the firebox, the undisturbed woodpile, the frozen ground that showed nothing. He told it in the order he had found it, which was important, because the order was part of the account. the accumulation of ordinary facts that became in aggregate a fact with no ordinary explanation. People listened and asked about the green wood most often, because the green wood was the thing that the physical world had no account for. The fire could have been a slow-burning, long-loaded fire from before Hensley's departure. Possible, if he had stoked it heavily before leaving. The kettle could have been a coincidence of timing. Possible, though unlikely. But the green wood was freshly cut, and there was no source for it in the yard, and no tracks and no axe marks. And those four facts together made a thing that no one could explain away, and that the valley sat with the way the valley sat, with things it could not explain. Honestly, without pretending to a resolution that did not exist. Hensley told his part of it once, to Turner and to Pratt together. And then he did not tell it again, which was his right and which the settlement respected. He had said what he had experienced, and he had noted that the two experiences, the road and the dream, had a relationship that he was not going to reduce to an explanation, and that was the end of what he had to say. Old Pratt said, when Turner repeated all of this to him, yes, he said it as though it confirmed what he had been thinking and not as though it surprised him. Turner said, "You expected this." Pratt said, "I expected something like this." He said, "I've known Hensley for 30 years. I've known men who had a particular relationship with the places they'd built their lives on, and Hensley was always one of those men." He said, "A man who farms a piece of ground alone for 8 years and who loves it the way he loves it. The ground knows him. The farm knows him." He said, "I don't think it's strange that when he was away, the farm kept its habits." Turner said, "The fire is not a habit. A habit is a pattern of behavior. A fire requires someone to feed it." Pratt said, "Yes," he said, "that's what I'm saying." Turner said, "You're saying Hensley fed it." Pratt said, "I'm saying some part of Hensley fed it." He said, "Not the part that was on the road, the part that was here." Turner said, "A man can't be in two places." Pratt said, "A man's body can be in one place." He said, "I've thought about this question for a long time, and I think that's the most accurate thing I can say about it." He paused. "I've known men who came back to places after they had left them in ways that were not explainable by the physical account. I've known places that held their people across distances in ways that should not have been possible." He said, "I think the farm held Hensley's fire." He said, "I think Hensley let it." The smoke stopped the morning Hensley returned. The valley noted this with the specific attention of people who had been watching the chimney for 3 days and who had, in the watching, developed a relationship to the smoke that went beyond ordinary observation. The smoke had become, over 3 days, a question that the valley was living with, a presence that each morning of that February confirmed and each evening left unresolved. When it stopped completely, the chimney going cold on the morning of the 13th as Hensley's wagon came up the road from the south. For the rest of that winter, the people of the valley said the fire had burned exactly the way a man kept a fire when he expected someone to come home. Not too high, not too low. The steady, managed heat of a fire under the attention of someone who knew the room and knew the cold and knew how much was needed to keep the house as it should be kept until the person it was kept for arrived. And it had stopped the moment he came through the gate. As though the farm knew, in whatever way farms knew the things they knew about the people who had shaped them, that the keeping was finished, that the one it had been keeping it for was home.